Every now and then, I've seen my video from the earliest days of Splatoon 3 Ranked get recommended on YouTube. Splatoon 3's letter rankings barely mean anything compared to how useful they were in Splatoon 2. The video is obviously not current anymore, as it references a time where there was no X-Rank mode yet. I've decided to leave it up because I think it's a good time capsule for the beginning of Splatoon 3, but with the many critical changes that have been made to the game since then, it also merits revisiting. Let's talk about the user experience of Splatoon 3 solo queue in Fresh Season 2024. Anarchy series itself is still the same. Barely mean anything. And frankly, the only people I've seen take it particularly seriously are players who have yet to unlock X-Rank. Its matchmaking and rewards system just aren't designed to reward winning the game the way the strongest players will care to grind for. You can still, as far as I'm aware, be S plus 50 and run into players that are A rank. It still rewards playing the game frequently, to a degree that playing the game frequently can offset disparities in player skill. You can still go positive in points on a ticket where you had 2 wins and 3 losses. But with X-Rank now available, and available to players at lower skill levels than it was available to in Splatoon 2, we have a replacement that satisfies the needs series didn't, so it's a lot less of a problem. X-Rank, however, has a lot of quirks that make it behave differently than in Splatoon 2, and that's what I'll focus on the most in this video. During endgame Splatoon 2, I peaked at just over 2400 X-Power and averaged somewhere in the 2200s. When Splatoon 3 came out, obviously Anarchy series was all we had, so there's a gap in my X-Rank activity, but X-Rank did eventually release, and early on my ranks were pretty consistent with what they had been in Splatoon 2. I set a new peak in the upper 2400s and broke 2400 in more modes than I had before, but there wasn't a super significant difference for me. However, at the top end, things were already a lot different. See, in Splatoon 2, you gained or lost points on a game-by-game basis, and the gains and losses were not necessarily equal. If you were much higher ranked than the average of the players on the other team, a win barely got you anything, fractions of a single point, while every now and then a loss could drop you by 70. The win rates it took to reach the highest peaks were just spectacular, and so it was truly remarkable when Zero became the first North American player ever to reach an X-Power of 3000 in Splatoon 2. He'll probably still be putting that achievement on his work resume years from now. In Splatoon 3, on the other hand, all you have to do to ensure positive point gain is to win a best of 5, a flat 60% win rate assuming it goes all 5 games. It's way easier in this game to guarantee that your points at least don't go down as a result of losing 1 or even 2 games out of 5. People started breaking 3000 X-Power way earlier in Splatoon 3's lifespan than they ever had in Splatoon 2, and people quickly began to realize that X-Powers were inflated from what they once were. Back then, 3000 meant indisputable elite status in the game of Splatoon. My understanding, though I may be off here, is that there were probably only something like 50 players on the planet who ever achieved it. And since points gained depended on the scores of your opponents, the vast majority of the 3Ks were from Japan, where they were likely to be matched against other opponents with higher X-Powers on average to earn points from. In Splatoon 3, 3K X-Power basically just means that you can hit like Div 1 or something in Ludi. It's top 500 in your division, not something the top 1 has only done one time after a long extraordinary grind dedicated singularly to that achievement. Part of this comes from the flat minimum changes in X-Power, which didn't exist in Splatoon 2. At lower X-Powers, you're guaranteed at least 25 points for winning a ticket, and even above 3000 X-Power, you're still guaranteed 10, even for a 3-2. The game will never decide that a match was too easy to be worth a substantial number of points. Elite players can climb a reasonable amount from any team they face, no matter how dominant they are over them. Sure, a loss will still cost them multiple hundreds of points, and it's still impressive for them to keep their streaks going. But if they simply do not lose, it's orders of magnitude harder for this system to cap their score, and one imagines it can go arbitrarily high. I don't mean to undercut the achievement for those who have reached 3K, because man, that is still really, really impressive. It's still a real flex as far as Splatoon skill goes. But Melon, a well-known elite-level Japanese player, hit 5,000 X power on this new system a couple months ago. He and Nyagora have kept trading the record back and forth for a lot of Splatoon 3's lifespan, and every time they post new numbers, I hesitate. I recognize that these guys are true masters and artists of the game of Splatoon. Players who you watch make incredibly consistent, correct decisions effortlessly, who make you think, oh, that's how this game is supposed to be played. It makes sense now. Even so, I also have a moment of hesitation where I look at the numbers they're putting up and I think, does this mean the players have actually gotten that much better? Or does it mean that the numbers just mean less now? Because there's a flat limit to the number of points you can gain or lose, the inflation of X powers also causes a deflation on the lower end of the spectrum. In Splatoon 2, where points gained and lost depended on the average powers of the teams you played against, you could reach a point where your score was low enough that you wouldn't lose nearly as many points, because, to put it figuratively, the game simply didn't expect you to win. If you won, it was an upset, and it was recognized and rewarded as such. But if you lost, the game recognized that it had given you a difficult task and didn't penalize you too harshly. Both the top and bottom end were rubber banded back toward the mean score. Not as much so in Splatoon 3. So now, while the upper bound is seemingly uncapped right now, the lower bound is also much lower. And without a system demoting players to S+9 if they drop too low, it's possible to get powers the likes of which you would have seen in Splatoon 2's A rank, in what Splatoon 3 calls X rank. I've set my all-time X power peak across both games in Splatoon 3, but I've also dropped below 1800 on some bad placement matches, something that's essentially impossible to do in Splatoon 2 without going back to the S+ fill the meter system. These aren't just inferences I'm making based on patch notes. We have data to back this up, specifically coming from Data Nerd, Joy the Data Nerd. Joy has been taking snapshots of the top 500 X powers to track their progression every 10 minutes since March. Before then, it was only every 15 minutes. So in case you haven't guessed, this isn't just manual data collection, this is software-based. Note that this just takes in the scores on the leaderboard, not that it's tracking any one individual player. For all we know, the 500 players in the first data points on the list are completely swapped out with 500 totally different players multiple times as this one line stretches out. Maybe Kyo and Zero and Bagel and .Q and Basil and Goss and Leafy and Yoshell and everyone were all playing a tournament day one of the ranking season and didn't have time to get their powers until later in the week, at which point they kicked a bunch of people off the leaderboard. But this is what we have available, and it does show general community-wide trends pretty well. There was already an inflation of upper bound X powers just going from Splatoon 2 to Splatoon 3, and all you really need to do to know that is to look at how many players have 3,000 X power in their Twitter bios. More than one of them? Yeah, okay, so this system must be a little easier to hit 3K in. But Joy's data shows us that even just between Chill Season 2023 and Fresh Season 2024, as the season went on, the top 500 diverged and reached much higher peaks across the board than they had one season earlier. While the powers actually started out lower, it's the peaks that people talk about and put in their Twitter bios, so this ultimately inflates the top 500 scores more than it had before. We don't have global access to everyone's powers, just the top 500 that gets posted on the leaderboards, but Joy does think it's safe to assume that a similar thing is happening in reverse at the bottom. It is pretty common that at a certain point a player will go, okay, my placements were bad and I just dropped another ticket, so my score is going to take forever to dig out of this hole. Let's just stop for now and try again next season, or play a different playlist like Anarchy. On the flip side, you could probably see a similar effect for players that reach a new peak and pop off about it, but then lose the next ticket and drop 200 points or something and decide, it's okay. I already did it. I can wait to grind a new peak. Still, Joy's hunch is that the discouragement of a losing record might thin the numbers on the bottom side of X rank more than it does on the top side. Another massive change that came with the 6.0.0 update was the division of X rank around the 2000 mark. If you're below 2000, you will only play with other players below 2000. And if you're at or above 2000, you'll only play with players at or above 2000. I think this is a good change overall for a couple reasons. It's a frequent frustration of top-level players that, despite reaching higher ranks, they still have to play with players at much lower levels than them, and the practice they're getting isn't training the best habits for competitive play. They may need to play more selfishly, rely less on their teammates than they'd ideally want to. They simply know better than their teammates and have the mechanical skill to outplay lower-level opponents and compensate for the lack of proper coordination. This change certainly doesn't fix that problem. Someone at 2050 is still hilariously outmatched by a player like Kiver, but it does cap the problem at 2K instead of at, say, 1700, and it does so without compromising fast matchmaking, because the pool of players above 2K is still quite large. One effect that some people might not like is in the transition between below and above 2K. When you're at 1999.9, like I recently was in Rainmaker, you are numerically the very best player that can possibly be put into your lobby. As soon as you win a single ticket, you bump up into 2K plus matchmaking, and you're pretty darn close to numerically the worst player that can be in that lobby. That's a bit of a shock for people sometimes, and it can cause people to dip back and forth across that line a lot before they get enough of a handle on 2K plus gameplay that they can hang with the players at that level. But this is a consequence of any system with discrete, bounded matchmaking pools like this. Every new letter rank in Splatoon 2 worked exactly the same way, with one of the biggest Glicko whirlpools being at the boundary between S+9 and X rank. You can call it ELO hell if you like, but I remember feeling proud of at first being overwhelmed in X rank, then returning to S+, and feeling more confident in using what I'd learned in X rank to get out of S+ more quickly and stay in X longer. Once I stayed for good, it felt like I'd really earned it. This gets at the root of my feelings about Splatoon 3's ranking system. While I think the system is more forgiving, more likely to give you a feeling of accomplishment, I also think it does a worse job of showing you whether you've actually learned and improved. It's not just because they've made really major changes to how X-Rank works on the recent patch. That has, to be clear, had a negative effect. It's shifted the goalposts. A 2100 on a previous patch doesn't mean the same as a 2100 on a later patch, and I don't feel like that was ever the case in Splatoon 2's lifespan. But throughout the game, in Anarchy's series, and to an extent in X-Rank at higher levels, it's easier to just accumulate points at high flat minimums that add up to inflated scores. Whether you think that's good or not becomes a philosophical question. And when have we ever tackled those on this channel? As for me, I want a system that will be brutally honest with me and actually tell me how strong I am as a player. I want the number it gives me to very consistently mean the same thing for as long as I have that number, and that if that number increases, for it to mean that I've earned it. If I don't perform as well as I expect, I want the number to give me that hard truth so I can recognize that something needs to be addressed, so that I reflect on my own gameplay instead of deciding the loss was outside my control and playing the blame game. I want to be wowed by top players achieving really high numbers, not just because number big, but because it was always exactly as difficult to reach that number at any point in the game's lifespan, and that a new record actually represents a higher level of skill and effort than was dedicated to the task before. I think a consistent system like that is the best tool for us to learn from, as long as we come at it with the right mindset. I don't think I'm actually in the majority in wanting that, though. I'm a competitive player, well within the top 1% in terms of skill in the game's population. For someone who plays the game more casually, they may not be looking to learn the game and test themselves as rigorously as I am. What Splatoon 3's system does well is create the appearance of very clear goals to work toward and a discrete, predictable reward or punishment for meeting or failing to meet those goals. Of course, thinking rationally, we can look at the goals and see that they're not actually as aligned with player skill as they could be. Scoring game by game and comparing wins against weaker players to wins against stronger players differently will make the number a better predictor of who would actually win a game between two players or two teams. But is the typical Splatoon player really lobbying up in solo queue because they want the most reliable predictor of whether they'll win or lose? That's the mindset of players who enter tournaments. The players who sit down for solo queue may be looking for matches where everyone's trying their hardest, but maybe the experience they're looking for is better served by these clearer goals, less frustrating or unpredictable consequences, this margin for error. Maybe, from a game design perspective, this is actually the better way to serve the needs of the diverse audience they've got. I just wonder if, maybe, were an audience more familiar with the system, knew how much less reliable its numbers were, if the typical player had a more critical evaluation of it, if they'd feel differently about it. Maybe, recognizing that the powers don't line up as well with past powers and can't be used to track player progression quite as effectively would cause us to value the system's superior presentation less than we do. There are aspects of Splatoon 3's ranking system that I do want to see return in future installments, that I think are steps forward for the franchise. But this peek under the hood gives me a sinking feeling sometimes that maybe the way the game's design has been shifted by popular demand, or by Nintendo's perception of popular demand, is in a direction that undermines its utility as a competitive game, as a learning tool for us to use to understand ourselves. It's still quite a good system even as it is. I'm conflicted. Let me know what you think in the comments.